It's really, it really is an honor for me to be here today. When I look out into the audience, I see some very respected individuals who work in the industry that I do. People like Todd Corral, as many of you know, is probably one of Canada's foremost photojournalists. Some of the folks from SAIT's very respected photojournalism department. So I really feel honored at the presence of folks like that. My colleague Steve Spears, a wonderful designer. Royce Holland, with a partner of his, probably runs the best digital print shop in Western Canada. So this is great. So I feel I'm among peers, and for any of you that I don't know, thanks very much for coming. Just a quick little, very brief little biographical thing before we start looking at the photographs. About 40 years ago, I have a political science and a journalism degree. And as many of my colleagues know, I don't kind of really know or understand photography. I've been teaching it and doing it for many years, but I don't have kind of an aptitude for the technical side. It's really, for me, it's more the spiritual or narrative or aesthetic side that I think I have some gifts. About 40 years ago, I came across a book. Some of you will know it. It's one of the most iconic 20th century photography books. It's a book called The Decisive Moment. It was a book that was done by the great French master Henri Cartier-Bresson. I saw the book. I was a writer at the time. I closed the book, and I wanted to be a photographer real bad from that moment forward. So that was a huge thing. The other thing that's really been kind of a bedrock thing in my career is I just have a phenomenal affection for this part of the world. I was born in Drumheller. We lived there till I was 7. I'd walk downtown. Everybody said, "Oh, you're Frank's grandson, or you're Dell's boy," or something. I really had a sense of connection and safety. I really had a connection with being able to see, I would see Hutterite people, First Nations people, the small town. And so at age 7, which, as the Jesuits say, as you know, that's kind of the decisive age for people. Because by the time you're 7, your values, your perspectives, they're largely formed by the age of 7 years. We left Drumheller, came to this city of 200,000 people at that time. And then about 20 years later, I found myself, after reading this book, I picked up a camera and I started to photograph. And so really I've spent 40 years essentially just kind of going deep into what's here. William Faulkner once spoke about he spoke about the fact that there was a little piece of the rural South that if he lived, for a lifetime, he'd never fully be able to explore it. So what I've done over the years is I've photographed extensively in First Nations communities, Hutterite communities, lots of photography over the last decade in Calgary, which I find an extraordinarily interesting place to photograph. The photographs we're going to look at today are from a book called Prairie Gothic. And my way of working, my favorite way of working is just to wander out into the landscape and just see, aptly relating to this, the theme of this talk, the magic that I might find in those places. And I'm keenly aware, I was born in the Drumheller General Hospital, February 7th, 1952, and so the arc of my life in terms of time and place is, it's kind of moving through the universe, essentially. The chances of me being in each one of the places and meeting each one of the people that I encountered in these photographs was it's like 1,000,000,000 to 1. The timing, the place, all of those things really kind of conspire to not have you in that particular place at that particular moment. And of course, photography is all about that. You have to be standing in front of a particular place or in front of a particular person at a particular moment. So there's this sense of the vulnerability and the chanciness that you're going to encounter these folks. So some of the photographs that I'll just speak briefly about, and many of them have great stories behind them, because I'm so attracted to the idea of the narrative in my work. the stories are often, the backstories are often for me, you know, they're the catnip, they're the thing that draws me in, and then the photographs arise from them. So, you know, and then there's these juxtapositions like this lightning strike. You know, you can see, as Todd will tell you, shooting lightning in the middle of the day, it's a tough thing, right? You got to kind of start shooting, and then just at the second your finger hits the shutter release, the lightning has to fire. So if you see it, it's too late. If you don't see it, it's typically too early. There's luck involved in it, right? And then of course there's something like this, where there's this, you know, that lightning bolt years later is evoked in this torn curtain in this rectory. A guy named Joseph Privé, he'd fought in the Second World War. He lived with his mother for his entire life. She passed away. He went to he went to a dance in a place called Viceroy looking for a wife. He found a wife. He brought her back. They married. She passed away. And he was living at this point in his life in relative isolation. He was kind of a custodian of a rectory, a residence for priests in a little community, beautifully named. As you're driving down the highway, I thought, not being bilingual, I thought I was in Forget, Saskatchewan. I was in fact in Forget, Saskatchewan. Right? And so when we met, he showed me around. He was telling me he was in his 70s. You know, the fact that we met, I was in a little interpretive thing. The door creaks open. I look back. I see him. And he tells me his story. We have a meal together. He tells me that he's been under the care of a public health nurse, a young woman in her 20s. And as the conversation, you know, unfolds, he asked me, frankly, what do you think my chances are with this 27-year-old? I said, pretty good, probably. And then 20 years later, I was in Saskatchewan a few years ago. I tried to find him, couldn't, but somebody gave me a lead, and I tracked him down in a seniors complex, and he looked up at me, no idea, right? That was all. Okay, and a lot of these interactions with and there he is actually, yeah. Many of these, they're very ephemeral, and they're based on this little blessing, this little gift, this little bit of magic that that brings you into connection with an individual. And I've tried to cultivate the mindset over the years. A lot of the photography that I do does relate to getting into places where some people say putting your nose into places where you shouldn't. Other people say there's kind of an earnest quality in the way in which I approach people that tends to open them up to the possibility of doing photographs. But I'm very conscious of the fact that it's in photography, and somebody like Todd can really tell us, photography is a very, very one-sided thing a lot of the time. A lot of the power resides with the maker of the image, the editor of the image, and that sort of thing. So when you're entering into situations, especially of great vulnerability or danger with people, something really truly magical does have to happen, in the sense that you are asking for the intimacy of their trust, but you can't have earned it at that point. So there's that leap. People, they have to be able to size you up and sense that they're going to be safe and that they're going to be respected in your presence. I've done a lot of photography on the blood reserve. Sometimes when I think back, you walk up to a house or a room in the King Eddie Hotel, and you walk up to the door, you knock, you don't know if there's sex, drugs, homicide going on the other side, and all I do, and the idea that I want to walk in and say, you don't know me, you don't know anything about me, but would it be okay if I came in and basically entered into the most intimate space in your life and started to photograph? No, I try to couch it in slightly gentler terms than that when I'm doing it, but the idea of it is still kind of shocking, and it's something, again, I couldn't kind of do this on my own. And as with all art forms, all works of creative work, we largely stand on the shoulders of the people that have preceded us. And one of my great inspirations, many of you will know the work of the great American documentary photographer, Deanne Arbus to people who knew her well. And she was this tiny Jewish upper middle class woman, and she was sort of fearless, basically. She would go anywhere, she would approach people. The example of her work and her life, people like Bruce Davidson, another great documentary photographer, had a profound influence, and I admired their work so deeply, and I wondered how do you get into these places? How do you gain the trust of people you can't really have earned at that point, right? This father and daughter, I was in a little town in Saskatchewan, I was photographing in the post office. The postmaster said, "You should go and visit Torvald, and he lives down the street, and you go down over here." So I drove up to the front of the house. The guy walks out like, "Doesn't this happen every day?" kind of a thing, right? Some guy from Calgary wants to come and meet me and photograph me, right? So I went into the house, and so we went into the back. He showed me around. He was a blacksmith, and he said, "Would you like to come in and you can meet my daughter?" And so we went into the house, and there was this woman, Margaret Ann, and I could see her from the back. She was coloring, which was slightly disorienting because she was an adult woman and she was coloring in a coloring book, and he introduced me to her. And my sister, who's a nurse, when she saw the photograph, said, well, and I didn't fully understand, but that Margaret Ann was hydrocephalic. She had this enlarged brain and an impaired cognitive abilities, essentially. And, there were a couple of things that were really touching and memorable. First of all, his openness to me, his trust, his pride in his daughter. And this is also an example, I think, of sometimes the slipperiness of a photograph as a document. This photograph does have sort of a poignant or sad quality, which is certainly true to some extent, but their relationship, if you saw her, she was impeccably groomed, she was cared for, she felt a sense of safety and joy in her father's presence. So they were very close, right? And the photograph, the space, their size in the photograph, the seriousness of the photograph implies something kind of sad, and I guess obviously it is. I mean, because her mother, Torvald's wife, had passed away a number of years earlier. It was just the two of them in this little town. It was in a sense a poignant thing. When I'd finished doing the photographs, he asked me, as people often do, could you send me a photograph? And and he said, I said, well, what's your address so I can note it in my journal? And he said, gee, I can't remember. So we started looking around the house, and I was in the living room. Margaret Ann was sort of in a little kitchen alcove, and he was in the back of the house. And so we were looking around, calling back. We were looking for a magazine or an envelope that might have an address on it. And this went on for 5 minutes, sort of a thing. And then there was this little moment of equipoise. There was silence, and then Margaret Ann holds up this envelope from the kitchen table, right? She looks back at me, she smiles, she looks at her dad, and you just think like, wow, this is special, And wordlessly, it was that thing. It was not that she was sort of so much taking power in that situation, but that she felt safe. She felt safe with me, she felt safe with her dad, and she wanted to be part of that interaction, and she was beautifully and wordlessly, as it turned out. This is a little place called New Dayton, and the next photographs I'm going to show you are perhaps the most sort of emblematic from the project. And the story is one that many of you have heard, but this truly is a story that repeats retelling for any of you that have heard it, and for any of you that haven't, you'll understand why. I'd been photographing in the States, down in Montana, and as I commonly do, I'll get in my truck and I drive, and my little orbit, compared to guys like Todd, who's all over the world kind of stuff, right? I'm just here in my one little, piece of southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan. And But I'd been in the States, I was driving back, and it had been, and photography is often like this. Somebody analogized it sometimes to like what war is like. You know, it's just long stretches of boredom, tedium, self-recrimination, doubt, you know, negative self-talk, and all of a sudden, bang, you're into a moment of something really special. And one of the talents of a great soldier, and one of the talents of a really skilled documentary photographer, you kind of just, you deal with like real life, which is often boring and full of, you know, uninteresting details and that sort of thing. But you try not to get so taken down by the just that part of life that you're not ready when the little magic things present themselves, and they will, and you have to be ready. You have to be mentally and spiritually ready to enter into those moments. So I was coming back, I was thinking I'm going to get back to Calgary, but I passed this little town of New Dayton. I could see it off just to my left as I was driving north. I thought, well, you know, it hasn't been a terribly good trip, but I'm going to stop. I'm going to check, and I saw this little general store, and so I went in and I met this gentleman, Mr. Chu. Asked him if I could do a couple of photographs because I was, as we all clearly would be, the inside of this place was iconic on every level, right? I mean, it was the perfect little Chinese store, which, you know, was such an important part of the history of small town Western Canada. So I did some photographs, and as I was packing up, he motioned to me to wait. He went into the back. He came back, and he had his tie on when he came back, right? And his wife was he had his arm around his wife, and he was bringing her forward. And I thought, wow, this is great. You know, I can photograph both of them. I was down to my last 12 exposure roll of film on a Hasselblad camera. I was at the first or second frame, so I thought, hey, this isn't going to be a problem. So I explained to them, because the light levels were low, that I would have to take a fairly slow exposure to get everything nice and sharp. And so I explained, and he kept turning to her and translating, and I thought that was a bit odd. I didn't understand, but I thought, okay. And so I'd be ready, and every time I was ready, I'd say, I'm going to shoot now, or I'd go 3, 2, 1, or I'm ready to shoot. And every time I shot, there was like this, okay. And so this was like frame 6, 8, 9, and I was just like, you know, it was agony kind of a thing, right? Luckily, there was one frame that was perfect, and it's this one. It's tack sharp. It's beautiful prints because of the size of it. As I was leaving, or as I was getting ready to leave, he said, or would you send us a photograph? And I said, yes. And because I don't think he felt it was quite right to just ask for something, so he slipped a package of Wrigley's spearmint gum, which I took and acknowledged, and that was good. So a couple of weeks later, I mailed a photograph, and then I just sort of lost touch with them. And then several years after that, I stopped down, and I went to the store, and it had been boarded up. There was no one there. I went into the back, because you could actually access it through a back door that had been kind of kicked in. Worked my way up, and there was a little like a cigar box sitting on the counter. And and it's my practice, which is the correct one for any of this kind of work. You never, you know, you can sometimes look, but you can never remove or change things when you're doing this kind of work. I opened it, and it was full of little, you know, kids' pictures, you know, that folks had lived in that community as children. And then I wondered, gee, well, what had happened to this couple? So there was somebody across the street who referenced me to a Chinese restaurant in Lethbridge, which was, you know, a half hour's drive away. So I drove to Lethbridge. I met this young man, and then he told me the story. And this is the story. Mr. and Mrs. Chu were married in 1930 in China. They had a daughter. She was several months old, you know, just very young, beautiful young girl. The decision was that he would come to Canada, and with his father, with Mr. Chu's father, they would establish this store, and then they would, once it was up and running, he would send for his wife. Shortly before he left, there was sort of a poignant but happy thing, right? There was another baby expected. So about the time he left, he saw in his wife's belly the evidence of this next child. He left. He came to Canada in 1931. He and his father established this business, and the plan was that they would reunite the family. Now, as some of you will know, there was a period in Canadian history where there were immigration and economic sanctions in place that made it difficult. It was an attempt to prevent Asian women from coming to the country, who would then become mothers of Canadian children, and then the community would really sort of take root in Canada. So because of those things and because of economic issues, Mrs. Chu didn't come to Canada until 1986. 55 years, this couple didn't lay eyes on each other. To the best of my knowledge, they didn't even communicate by phone. I found stacks of letters, which is a way that they communicated with each other, but they didn't have any intimate contact for over half a century. When she came to Canada, because she was so elderly, it wouldn't have been appropriate for her as a non-English speaking person to travel alone. So she came with the grandson, the man that I met in Lethbridge. That grandson was the son of this child. So Mr. Chu never met his own son, right? He saw him. I mean, he saw him here, but he never met him in real life. He met him only through his grandson. And what had happened after she came to Canada, they lived together for about 6 months, or 9 months, I think it was. She passed away. He passed away, I think, within 6 months of that. So this was my mom's all-time favorite photograph, and it's, of course, on some level, it's incredibly poignant and sad, but on another level, it's really, it's this miraculous fact that the two of them were in fact reunited so late in life. It's kind of a simple story, but it speaks, I think, eloquently and beautifully about so many values. And this sort of stuff, the day-to-day stuff, I think it's kind of where the magic is, and I think that the great documentary photography that is always a part of our culture is the stuff that looks at the day-to-day, and it looks at it respectfully and simply, as opposed to overtly dramatically or looking for the exotic, right? And sometimes and I guess I say I'm just a great, I find stories, there's kind of like food and milk and water for me. They kind of help me kind of get through life, and that certainly, that's what the store did end up looking like. It was almost made it into Heritage Park, but it's beyond repair now, and it's just falling away. That's a photograph taken in the back. I'm just going to get to another. This was another man I met, and it again touches on this theme of the Asian, these shop owners. But there's one other photograph that for me is kind of especially magic. And even though these photographs aren't terribly old now, 20 to 30 years, this really records a generation at a time which is completely gone to us now, as you know. A little piece of folk art not far from Wayne, Alberta. This is the photograph, and this I think will bring us to our 20 minutes. So I'll just talk about it briefly. And this is the gift thing. This is the magic, and the fact that really a lot of the great photography can really only be seen as a gift. Like you're there, you're in a place, you have a camera, there's something happening. You didn't make the camera, you didn't make the place. There's a higher power that brought all of those things together clearly. So I was in this little town called Neudorf around dusk, just kind of getting ready to head to where I could get to a motel. And I've got the camera out. There's an elevator, and I see these 3 kids coming toward me with guns. As an urban guy, like as a Calgary guy, you feel just a small. Now they seem like good kids, but I wasn't completely sure what to expect. And so that we started talking, and it's one of these cultural differences. Guns in the cities, they don't make a lot of sense, but in a rural community, for gopher, pigeon control, various things, you can make a case that they make sense in those kind of communities. So they walked up toward me, and it was kind of it was just the unbelievable, frank, unguarded quality, especially of the boy in the front, right? I mean, he's probably a great kid, but there's something something there, right? And so I was taking the photographs, and I noticed there was a boy, a young First Nations boy, and this is the thing that was, I think it's an incredible photograph, but I had very little to do with the thing that takes it from being something good into something kind of magic. It was shot with a lens which is slightly wide angle, so the boy, I think, probably didn't realize as he walked up that he would be in the photograph. Now, he lived in the community, these boys lived in the community. He knew he was First Nations. He didn't feel he was perhaps entitled or justified to speak to me or to speak with these boys or enter into this or even be present when the photograph is being made. But he walked up, he was watching, he was listening, and then he kneels down on the rail bed, right? And you think, wow, this is a magical thing in terms of what it's expressing, what it's referencing, what it's actually showing in this photograph. It's a miracle, right? You couldn't ever set something like this up. And the thing about the work that really is transcendent in the documentary tradition is, and people here that are photographers will tell you this, often, maybe even most of the time, the really great photographs are either magic or luck or a gift, whichever word aligns with your particular values. And something really sort of transcendent and very powerful is there, and it's so this. I see it from a spiritual perspective with my Catholic upbringing, but you could call it magic as well. So he kneels for a minute or two, take the photograph, he's up and he's gone, right? But it's a photograph too that I believe in this era of the filtered, the dramatic kind of a thing. That it's like great writing. I mean the really good stuff tends to be understated. It tends to sort of not grab one's attention. It's work which you have to spend time with. It's work which will reveal itself. And importantly, there's room for a sensitive or intelligent viewer, and I don't reference this photograph particularly, but any art and any really good photography, there's room for the viewer to enter into that. Because that photograph, and I've sort of talked through an interpretation from my standpoint, but the work which we tend to remember and that really affects us is the work that we have to kind of complete. Like you can look at that quickly through with a bunch of stuff, but if you choose to enter into a relationship or to contemplate that, or to think about the larger issues that are part of any good documentary photograph, it's like a little bit of me, it's a little bit of the boys, it's a little bit of the viewer, right? And the last thing I'll say, just because the other tradition in photography these days, of course, is the more dramatized. And there's photographers, most of you will know the work of someone like Annie Leibovitz, for instance. Very skilled magazine photographer. And it's all about proportions, I guess, as it is in baking, as my sisters tell me, right? If you look at a really great Annie Leibovitz photograph, and she's done the Whoopi Goldberg and the Milk and the Arnold Schwarzenegger, bare-chested on the horse, and what are some others that we would all know, right? The photographs, they're very powerful. They come off the page strong. Those photographs are roughly proportionally maybe about 80% about Annie Leibovitz and about 20% about who did I just say? Whoopi Goldberg, right? About the subject. And that's good, that's valid, that's craft of a very, very high order. There's other photographs that are like a real estate photograph, right? That are like about 100%, 99% about the thing and a little bit about the photographer. There are a few photographers that I personally place at the absolute highest possible place in terms of my respect for them. And if you're new to photography, these are names you might want to look at some point. Photographers like Eugene Auger, for what it's worth, my nominee for the greatest photographer of all time. Photographers like Walker Evans, the great American documentary photographer. And their work hits this like impossible thing. And that's what makes it so great. Is their work is exactly 50% about Eugene Auger and 50% about the culture and the history and the place that he's photographing. That sounds like it should be easy. How many people have done it, Todd? A handful in the history of photography, maybe, kind of thing, right? It's exquisitely difficult because photography, any kind of art form, any creative work is, of course, it's inevitably about the person, their gifts, their values, and that sort of thing. But there's that sensitivity, and I would say ultimately respect for the person, the place that you're photographing that has to be pitched to a very, very fine sort of a degree of perception. And so I think there's room within the genre of documentary photography for it to be exquisite, but only if you get it like just right. Some people say it's a little bit like diamond cutting. You got to hit just the right angle, at just the right pressure, at just the right time. And as Todd will tell you, you fail 99.99% of it. Every once in a while, you get lucky, and all those things kind of come together for it. So I think I've gone 25 minutes, so thank you. So and thanks for your attention. I can feel it coming back up here. And I'd love to take some questions, if there are any.
I'll jump in there. I mean, how has your relationship to photography changed from going from film to digital? Has that affected how you approach the whole process?
It's a good question, and you know, for me, not a lot. I'm technically challenged every time I learn a new thing with a camera or Photoshop or something. I find it a bit of a struggle. But the basic, and I've done, in the last 10 years, I've done 6 books. I've been very fortunate. 4 of them with film, 2 digitally, with digital capture. And the fundamental kind of values for me about the direct, the simple. So a lot of my digital stuff kind of looks like it could have been shot on film, and it's, you know, it has to do with lens choices. I work with either a normal lens or a slightly wide angle. I do very sort of minimal editing. I virtually never crop any of the images. You get to shoot more. You get to experiment a bit more. There's now wonderful options. You go to a place like Royce, and you can get a print made that will last for like 500 years if you can get your head around it, right? So there's things in the digital world now that are actually, this hurts me to say that are actually superior to film in terms of longevity, some of the printing processes. But the basic approach and everything is very similar. You tend to shoot more, as you know, digitally.
Is there any one thing you really miss from traditional film?
Well, no, because I've never given it up. I was out, yesterday I was out at the Hutterite colony. A little girl that I photographed when she was 5 is getting married on Saturday. She's 22 right now. So am I going to shoot that on, well, I actually did, because the kids all now have, like, it kills me, right? They've all got smartphones and they're all connected and everything. So but I'm going to make some prints for her in my darkroom as well, right? So I still, and Todd, my colleague here too, we still, people that have darkrooms, there's things that you just think, yeah, this would be so right to shoot this project on film, and so you tend to do that. So I use it less. I use film mainly for personal projects right now, but still have it. I think it does kind of sharpen the eye. It keeps some channels of intuition finely tuned, I think. But digital is really, really, really good. And as I get older, you know, I'll still shoot film, but digital will likely become an even more important part of my documentary work as well.
Can you speak to the difference between black and white and color photos?
Yeah, just the question of black and white or color. And you know, on one level, the thing I like about black and white work tends to produce things which have kind of a timeless, heroic, iconic sort of a feel. Black and white, of course, its great strength is in as with art in general is in terms of its subtraction of stuff. Like, you know, if you look around, there's like a lifetime worth of stuff you could see just in this room. Black and white starts more abstractly. It starts with kind of a heroic, kind of a iconic, graphic sort of a look to it. I think this is not true, but I'm going to just say this. I think black and white work tends to have a kind of a more spiritual, iconic quality to it. Color photography is, of course, richly imbued with the capacity to record information. An example, I did a book about this photograph would be just like crushed if it was in color, right? Because the kid might have some red in his shirt, green, it would just be this discordant color thing, right? So this project and this photograph is much stronger. It's much easier to make a good photograph of this in black and white. Color is informationally rich. I did a book a number of years ago on the East Village called Last Call. I started shooting it in black and white. I got well into it, and I thought, that's wrong. This is not right for this particular project, because there was a lot of the palette, the acidic kind of color, and the artificial light stuff that really wanted to be shot in color. So it's largely, as most creative work is, it's largely an intuitive response. Currently, again, if you're a student of photography, the photographer's work I look at most these days, and I get the greatest pleasure from, and some of you will know the name, is a man sometimes called, the world's greatest living photographer, a man named William Eggleston. And William Eggleston is photographed extensively, especially in the American South, and his work is the color is so great, right? And it's so embedded in what makes those photographs work well that so I like both. I like film, I like digital, I like color, I like black and white. And there just seems to be an inevitability. You shoot, you get into a project, and you just sense that, no, I'm going the wrong way. Or often just right from the beginning, right? And so I'm working on a couple of really long-term projects right now that are color-based, that go back to the 80s, actually. An exhibition that's going to be part of the Exposure Photography Festival next year. And it's stuff that, and with a lot of these kind of projects, this isn't quite the answer to the question, but my typical way of working is I shoot stuff, I don't tell anybody what I'm doing. Then I develop it, don't tell anybody. Edit it, don't tell anybody. Put it in a box in the basement, at the back of the basement, don't tell anybody that I'm doing it, right? People like Lee Friedlander, not to compare, he does that kind of thing. So the idea is that there's a lot of, it's a very private, intimate sort of an act, and that is a very, very freeing kind of a thing. I'm just terrified of getting my stuff out there and people seeing it and commenting on it, right? It just kind of, and there's, so what happens is you work on things for a very long period of time, and then you shuffle through the box or the hard drive, and all of a sudden there's something in there, right? It's kind of a prospecting thing as well to some extent. I think we're probably over. I'm happy to stay.
Time for one more question, somebody?
Royce.
Throw one more at you.
Sure.
You spoke in a way that resonates really powerfully with me about the balance of the respect for your subject or place versus what you bring as a photographer. On the side of the photographer, a couple of things that I've been kind of looking at lately, speaking in writing terms, a couple of quotes that I've seen. One is the cliche that we all know, which is write what you know.
Yeah.
So research and understand and dig deep and then produce work from a depth of knowledge. But there was a quote I had recently that said that write what you know is advice for amateurs. Write what you imagine, or what you dream, or what you never expected. So can you comment on the balance between writing from photographing from the familiar and from what you know and your rootedness in the area, but then the discovery, the unexpected, that magic moment? How do you balance those in your approach to making photographs?
It's a good question, and I think it's like, as with a lot of great quotes, they're both completely true, completely false. They both carry elements of the truth. I think what it is really, I think the bottom line is that it really ultimately hinges on a certain level of self-respect and self-trust, that you kind of do what you feel you should do. I think that best is achieved by keeping things fairly close early on in the working with the project. Either thing has great possibility, either thing has great danger in it, right? If you are the sort of person who photographs when they travel, you can be like Susan Sontag said, you can be just this kind of rapacious, promiscuous tourist, right? Where somebody's just kind of fodder, you look, you consume, you digest that material that's around you, right? It's possible to become sort of insular if you just look at one thing. I think too much. I think there's, but really, it's one of those things that if you sort of do where your intuition leads you to. I've got 4 sisters. I'm a huge fan, especially female intuition, but Yeah, even guys have got some intuition, right? And I think in the kind of the honoring of that, at least for part of your life, because most of us, we work, we do assignments, we do stuff, but it's there is something like incredibly. I mean, there's a satisfaction and kind of a quality of joy that occurs in these moments of intimacy that are the product of, I guess, some knowledge of the place you live, and then just those, for me, as a somewhat introverted personality, just the camera kind of gets you and kind of yanks you through that landscape sort of a thing, right? And it's, but ultimately, I think the thing that motivates, and I think often it can lead to the best and most interesting work, is stuff that, really touches on, like for me, two-pronged desire: one, to enter into some kind of intimacy, and two, to get out of this place for a little while, which photography is so beautifully gifted for. Because photography is always about looking out. That's one thing. And photography is always about appreciating what you see. And the third great thing about photography is inherent in its DNA is the assumption that what's happening now will have value tomorrow. That's a good thing. On a lot of days, that's something we need to be reminded of, I think. I thank you for that question.